Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the panel, The Wars Are Here, How the Post-9/11 Wars Helped Militarize U.S. Police. This panel is hosted by the Costs of War Project. I'm the co-director of the Costs of War. My name is Stephanie Savell. And the Costs of War Project is based at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, but we draw on research from over 50 scholars around the world to shed light on the hidden or unacknowledged costs of the post-9/11 wars. And we use the costs in a very broad sense, financial, but also social, human, environmental costs. You can find all of our reports at our website. It's www.costs, plural, costsofwar.org. There have been a lot of events and a lot of focus on police militarization recently. And what makes this panel different is that we are connecting the issue of police militarization with the post-9/11 wars in a very explicit and data-driven way. Today we released a paper by Jessica Katzenstein, and you'll hear from her in a moment, which situates intensified police militarization as a direct consequence of the post-9/11 wars, not as a byproduct, but as an intentional set of budgetary and policy choices oriented around fighting potential terrorist threats on the home front. So each panelist is going to speak for around 5 minutes, and I'll briefly introduce each person just before they speak, but just briefly, here's the lineup. We'll have Congressman Hank Johnson, who represents Georgia's 4th District, Jessica Katzenstein, the lead author of the study, Fana Jamal, a scholar at UCLA School of Law, Yasmin Tayeb, Senior Policy Counsel at Demand Progress, and Rana Epting, the Executive Director of Move On. After Rana, the last person, speaks, we'll end the live stream, and those of you who are on the registered Watson webinar can stay on the line for a short Q&A with the panelists. So please type your questions in the chat box as the panel goes along, and I'll collect those for the end. Those of you who are on the Facebook live stream, please click the share button so that you can share this live stream with your friends as we're going along. So Congressman Hank Johnson, he is in his 7th term representing Georgia's 4th District. He has been deeply involved in taking up issues of militarization at home and abroad through his service on the House Armed Services and Judiciary Committees. And he's become a leading national voice for the demilitarization of local law enforcement agencies through his sponsorship of the Stop Militarizing Law Enforcement Act. Congressman Johnson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and I want to thank the Watson Institute and Brown University, where it's based, for hosting this very important panel. And I want to thank all of the panelists for your contribution to the public knowledge of this very important issue, the creeping militarization of our law enforcement agencies in this country. It is something that is like a cancer, and it needs to be, we're going to have to perform surgery to root it out. But one of the causes of this militarization has been the National Defense Authorization Act, which during the George Herbert Walker Bush administration back in 1990 and 1991, authorized the transfer of surplus military equipment, including weapons and tactical vehicles, to law enforcement agencies. This was then in the Section 1208 of the National Defense Authorization Act. And so that began the ability of the military to transfer DOD, or Department of Defense weaponry, into domestic law enforcement agencies. And that process was speeded up in 1997 during the Clinton administration, which is where the 1033 program derived its name, because that was the section of the National Defense Authorization Act that allowed for the transfer of small arms and ammunition and other military equipment to law enforcement agencies within the country. And all of that was prefaced on fighting the war on drugs in 1990 and 1991, as well as in 1997. The purpose of the program was to assist law enforcement agencies in the fight against the drug trade. So the war on drugs, which was declared by Richard Nixon in 1971, is the origin of the 1033 program and its granddaddy, the 1208 program. And so I might add that the 1033 program in 1997 added counterterrorism as one of the goals or one of the reasons for the existence of the program, to assist law enforcement agencies in a counterterrorism fight along with counter-narcotics. And this program has played out on the streets of our cities and towns and in the countryside of America, actually producing input into the military, or well, not the military, but the prison industrial complex. So this war on drugs has fed that prison industrial complex, while at the same time, the transfer of weapons from the DOD to domestic law enforcement offers a big hole to fill perpetually by the Defense Department's voracious appetite, which is also known as the military industrial complex. So both of those complexes have been fed using the war on drugs and then the war on counterterrorism. And so with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Iraq was a war of choice, it has exacerbated this program and resulted in a torrent of weaponry onto our streets. And one of the aspects of the 1033 program has to do with a section that mandates that the equipment that is transferred from DOD to the law enforcement agencies has to be placed into use within 12 months from receipt of the equipment. And so that produces a scenario where these law enforcement agencies use this equipment when it's not really necessary in order to retain it. And this results in just a lot of problems, which your panelists will discuss later. But the bottom line is that it is time in this country for us to move away from the warrior mentality of policing. And by the way, I might add that in police departments across the land, you will find many veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You'll find reservists and National Guards people who have been deployed not just once, but multiple times. And so they go to the battlefield and then they bring that ethos back to their law enforcement jobs. And they also spread around that ethos to their friends. And they then have the equipment that they used to deal with, that they used to use on the battlefields. And so that creates a combination that is explosive, and it works against people of color in this country. So it's time to move away from the warrior mentality and back to the guardian mentality. Instead of a military mindset of go in and destroy and occupy and everyone is the enemy, we need to have a protect and serve resurgence of philosophy for law enforcement, a servant protector style of policing. And we will not be able to get that this new mindset installed until we close down this pipeline of military-grade weaponry straight from the battlefields to the police departments, and bypassing, by the way, the local city council or the county commission, the civilian authority, bypassing that authority and then arming and equipping law enforcement agencies with whatever they want. It's undemocratic. It's hurtful to our democracy and to our republic. And for those reasons and more, we need to do away with the 1033 program and shut down this pipeline. So with that, I will end my comments, and I look forward to hearing the comments of others as this panel proceeds. And thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much, Congressman Johnson. It's great to have you here. For those of you who are just joining us on Facebook live stream, this is a cost of war panel about how police militarization has been intensified by the post 9/11 wars. We're now going to hear from Jessica Katzenstein, who is a PhD candidate at Brown University and the lead author of today's study that Costs of War released. The Wars Are Here, How the United States Post 9/11 Wars Helped Militarize US Police. Jessica's dissertation ethnographically explores how militarization, training, community policing, and patrol work shape police responses to reform efforts. Jessica holds an MA in anthropology from Brown University and a BA from Washington University in St. Louis. She's a fellow with the Center for Engaged Scholarship. Jessica, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And thank you everyone for coming. Special thank you to my fellow panelists for getting together to discuss these important issues. I want to begin my brief remarks by noting that in this moment of potential transformation, it's really important to analyze both the deep roots and the recent upsurge of police militarization post 9/11 in order to grasp what calls for demilitarizing the police could mean. And my report traces US police militarization, which is continuous flow of course, military equipment, but also funding, personnel, surveillance technologies, et cetera, to domestic police. And I trace it from its colonial and anti-Black roots through its intensification after 9/11 to demonstrate how this division between the military and the police is a lot more slippery than we may sometimes think. In some ways, the wars have always been here. And my colleague, Dr. Jamal, I think will focus on this historical context next. I'm going to focus on how police militarization has exploded in the wake of the US-led post 9/11 wars. And specifically, I'll just talk about three things. One is the flow of military equipment to police. One is the expanding surveillance and intelligence infrastructure. And one is police departments hiring military veterans. And now what we saw after 9/11 is that the US government poured money into policing in the name of counterterrorism and homeland security. We saw the federal government open this sort of free-flowing spigot of military equipment and expertise. So in terms of equipment, what most people know about is the 1033 program, as Congressman Johnson just mentioned, which functionally recycles excess military equipment by distributing unneeded property to police departments for free. And this program transfers a lot of very banal items such as office supplies. And of course, more visibly, it also transfers weapons, robots, and mine-resistant vehicles. So in my research, I found that police arsenals today include over $25 million worth of equipment transferred by the 1033 program before 9/11, versus over $1.5 billion worth of equipment transferred since 9/11. And it's important to note that the 1033 program has come under by far the most scrutiny, but there are many other ways that police departments can obtain this equipment. There are other federal programs, they can requisition equipment through their budgets, and they can also get equipment through the proceeds from civil asset forfeiture. Which is where police departments can profit from property seized from people who are convicted or even just suspected of a crime. The second component is surveillance and intelligence infrastructure. And we saw in the wake of the 9/11 attacks that information sharing between US agencies became this major domestic priority. And in this, local police took up a novel role in the counterterror intelligence infrastructure as sort of this first line of homeland defense, these on-the-ground experts equipped to spot nascent terror threats. And most prominently, perhaps, we saw this in the New York Police Department's Muslim surveillance program, which over more than a decade secretly spied on, mapped, criminalized, and undermined the freedom and safety of Muslim communities in the name of counterterrorism. Police departments have also worked with ICE to track and identify suspected deportable immigrants. And during the recent George Floyd protests, local police departments alongside federal agencies use military-developed tools like predator drones to track and target activists. The third component that I'll talk about is veterans. Analyses suggest that around 25% of current police officers have either current or prior military service, compared to about 7% of the general population. And one issue that this creates is that many states have veterans preference laws, which give hiring advantages to veterans. And what this can mean for police departments is that even for departments that want to hire people of color and or women can be obstructed in that because veterans are disproportionately male and white. Another issue is that the recent legacy of veterans in policing is complex. Some data suggest that veterans are less likely to needlessly shoot civilians in fear. On the other hand, some studies suggest that they may be more likely to have fired their service weapons at least once in their careers, and that they receive more complaints from civilians. So military equipment, surveillance and intelligence, and veterans are three ways that wars have helped militarize US police since 9/11. And I'll just close by giving a quick survey of some of the costs of this upsurge. Now, one, of course, is economic, and the economic costs can be very difficult to track, but what we do know is that at minimum, tens of billions of taxpayer dollars since 9/11 have gone to military equipment transfer programs. And this has a cost, not just in economic terms, but also in opportunity costs. Every investment in drones, armored vehicles, and surveillance systems is a dollar denied to education, infrastructure, and renewable energy. Another cost is police violence and racialized control. We see these military equipment rolled out against Black and Indigenous-led movements, not, for instance, against the majority white Women's March. We also see that SWAT teams, paramilitary teams, deploy disproportionately against people of color. At a deeper level, this is also, there's the problem of critical analysis. The seeming extremity of seeing these armored personnel carriers on American streets can galvanize public outrage, but also make it seem like ratcheting back racialized police violence is primarily a question of limiting military equipment. Of course, that's important, but as well, the history of US police militarization reveals that such violence also runs a lot deeper than equipment transfers. And the final point is that another issue with sort of the sheer spectacle of militarization can also narrow our terms of analysis by implicitly legitimizing US military interventions. And we often see this, for instance, in coverage of Ferguson in 2014, that commentators, including progressive folks, will often sort of mark the visual similarity of how these protests are policed to Iraq, Ukraine, Gaza. And they argue that this kind of policing shouldn't happen at home, implying that state repression and US military violence elsewhere are simply to be expected. And these analyses can kind of serve to both naturalize the destruction of non-American targets of the US military and also obscure the connections between racist state violence in the US and abroad. So I will close there, and I'm looking forward to everyone else's comments and to all of your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Jessica. That was Jessica Katzenstein. She's the author of the Costs of War study released today called The Wars Are Here: How the United States Post-9/11 Wars Helped Militarize US Police. Next, we have Fana Jamal. She's a Binder Clinical Teaching Fellow at UCLA School of Law. Her writing and teaching focuses on criminal law, educational stratification, and clinical education. Her writing on juvenile justice, policing, and youth-centered advocacy has been published in the Columbia Journal of Gender and Law and the California Law Review, among other publications. Tonight, Fana will offer some historical context for our discussion. Thank you so much for being here, Fana.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So I first want to thank all the panelists. I've already learned so much from all of you and also from reading Jessica's report. So I hope everyone in the audience really takes time to look through that. So my name is Fana Jamal. I'm an attorney and I'm a teaching fellow, and I'm based in Los Angeles at the UCLA School of Law. So I'm supposed to speak today a little bit about some of the history that brought us to this current moment, and I definitely will do that. But first, I want to ground my remarks in a very urgent and contemporary example. So over the course of the last few weeks, we've witnessed the deployment of federal law enforcement to US cities to quell Black Lives Matter protests and uprisings. And so under the guise of protecting federal property, these troops have been filmed kidnapping protesters, placing them in unmarked vehicles, with little or no attention to their Fourth Amendment rights or to the constitutional protections. And so in the wake of these events, two things have really stood out to me. The first was what I can really only describe as a fundamental shift in the media and advocacy narrative. Gradually, I saw that the media shifted the story away from the killing of unarmed Black people at the hands of state and vigilante violence to the kidnapping of several white protesters in predominantly white cities like Portland, Oregon, a state with its very own astounding history of de jure Black exclusion. What was shocking to me is that the media coverage did little to meaningfully link the two phenomenon. It was as if the cause for the protest and the militarized repressive response were somehow disconnected. The military repression and racial subordination existed somehow discursively on different planes. The second thing that came to mind was, of course, historical precedent. In particular, I thought about a somewhat ironic example, post-Civil War America, where formerly enslaved Black people in the South were left at the mercy of racist Southern planter society, whose ultimate goal was to return these formerly enslaved people to bondage by legal or extra-legal means. It was in this climate that Black Americans found themselves in need of protection from federal troops, a protection that was at first granted, but then removed following the end of military reconstruction. So when the protection of this was a time when the protection of Black people threatened to disturb racial and economic hierarchies in both the North and the South. So of course, without federal protection, we can imagine what happened. Anti-Black violence erupted throughout the South. The number of lynchings climbed steadily, and violence and intimidation against Blacks increased. And during this time, the Republican-led federal government continued to laud the importance of local control over local affairs. The military was not to interfere in Southern affairs. And of course, the same government had no issue sending military troops to violently remove Native Americans from their land or to quell uprisings or strikes by Maryland railroad workers. But rather, it was militarized protection on behalf of Black rights that the federal government wanted to avoid. And it was, in fact, those who were advocating that what we might now deem as the demilitarization of the South were actually advocating for the rights of Southern planters to violently police, control, and exploit Black people economically. So what does this all mean? Why am I talking about kidnappings in Portland, Oregon, and federal intervention in the Reconstruction South? Here's why I think this is important. I think what this history teaches us is the necessity of maintaining a focus on anti-Black racism. I think it teaches us that the discourse of police militarization and demilitarization is actually somewhat misleading because it frames the problem as one of military equipment, surveillance, technology, and tactical and information sharing. But in reality, the problem is much deeper than this. The problem is the underlying ideologies that dole out protection to some and control to others. So we can demilitarize the police and still leave race, class, and gender subordination virtually untouched. The two are not mutually exclusive. So challenging militarization and the principles of militarism writ large will require us to better understand the relationship between the military and the police. the linkages between militarization at home and militarization abroad, and the justifications used to expand massive amounts of public funds on civilian police, and also authorize the US military to effectively serve as the police of the world. So of course, I don't have all the answers, but I have thought about this issue a lot, and I can say at least two things. The first would be that I feel like the first task is a scholarly and advocacy reframing away from police demilitarization to the racialized allocation of protection in our society. One of the protest chants that I've heard again and again as of late is the chant of people toward the police that demands, "Who are you protecting?" And I think we have an obligation as scholars and practitioners and advocates to constantly name the protection of white supremacy and corporate profit as central to the practice of both police and military action. Instead of simply advocating for demilitarization, we also need to advocate for a complete reimagining of what it means to be truly protected and secure in our society. And the second task, I would say, would be to aggressively call out the connections between militarization and austerity. So we gather today, half a year into a global pandemic, and half a year later, we still do not have the basic infrastructure in place to adequately fight or fight the pandemic and to save lives. So our healthcare workers do not have the equipment they need to avoid infection. Our school children do not have the infrastructure they need to continue their education. Many of our workers do not have the social safety net they need to stay home and prevent the spread of the virus. And we do not have the healthcare system we need to avoid preventable death and devastation. And yet the infrastructure deployed to quell protests and uprising has been phenomenal. The federal response has been without hesitation or delay. And this says something bigger about the dominant conception of protection, militarized or not. It says that protection does not come from targeted investments in education, healthcare, housing, or social security, but rather our social order needs protection from those who would challenge racialized inequality and neglect. What is heartening to me is that more and more people are waking up to this flawed logic. And so my hope is that from our various perches, we'll work to reveal and challenge this logic, to address not simply the branches of militarized policing, but also its roots. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fana. For those who are just joining us, this is a Costs of War panel about how police militarization has been intensified by the post-9/11 wars. Our next speaker is Yasmin Tayeb. She's the Senior Policy Counsel for Demand Progress, where she has played a leading role in advocating for demilitarized US policy both at home and abroad. She's an experienced human rights lawyer and advocate whose writings and commentaries have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Newsweek, among others. Thanks so much, Yasmin, for being here.
Great, thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you to Brown University's Cost of War Project, my co-panelists, and all of you for joining us this evening. I'm Yasmin Tayeb, Senior Policy Counsel for Demand Progress. Demand Progress is an organization with nearly 2 million members nationwide who fight for basic rights and freedoms needed for a modern democracy, including priorities around civil liberties, surveillance reform, to leading efforts to end militarization at home and abroad. I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to talk a little bit more about the background of the 1033 program, how it's changed in the last few years, why it's been so challenging for advocates to make significant advances in terms of curtailing and ultimately getting rid of this program, and next steps that you can take to support our efforts. So as has already been noted, the 1033 program, the Military Surplus Equipment Transfer Program, was formally established in the 1997 National Defense Authorization Act. This is the annual authorization policy bill for the Department of Defense, one of very few must-pass bills in Congress. And since the inception of the 1033 program, more than $7.4 billion in surplus military equipment and goods, including armored vehicles, rifles, and aircraft have been transferred to more than 8,000 law enforcement agencies across the country. The program is used for counter-drug, counter-terrorism, and border security activities. And as many of you know, it gained notoriety after the 2014 protests in Ferguson when Michael Brown was gunned down. So numerous research studies have been done about this program, the problems with it, and that it's actually unsafe and ineffective as it fails to reduce crime or improve police safety. Unfortunately, not much has changed in terms of the 1033 program being restricted. In fact, the program has continued to expand by further militarizing our borders. As my co-panelists have talked at length about this, there's a very strong connection and correlation between advocacy efforts in the anti-war space and efforts around ending police militarization. And many of our champions on curtailing the 1033 program similarly have been fighting to end our endless wars by repealing the 2001 and 2002 authorizations for use of military force. Many of our organizations believe that domestic police militarization, surveillance, institutionalized racism, and Islamophobia are directly linked to our militarized foreign policy, in part because they both entail the exploitation and dehumanization of communities of color. So after, many of us have been engaged in this fight in terms of trying to work to rein in and curtail the 1033 program for many, many years. Many of the folks on this call and the co-panelists. And, after George Floyd was murdered, millions of Americans across the country were protesting, trying to figure out ways that we can make a difference to try to voice our concerns and fight for the rights of our community members. So Bipartisan Coalition, immediately after George Floyd was murdered, came together as a coalition of more than 100 organizations that have been calling for this program to be reined in and ultimately shut down. Many of the organizations have been active in the anti-war movement for decades, and the grassroots has really been galvanized on this issue. More than 60,000 Demand Progress members alone wrote to Congress after George Floyd's murder, demanding that the 1033 program be abolished. Organizations from the right, such as Freedom Works, American Conservative Union, to organizations in the left, such as our colleagues at Move On, Indivisible, March for Our Lives, came together to denounce the militarization of our communities and again, support efforts to curtail this program. In 2015, as many of you know, President Obama issued an executive order that provided necessary oversight of this program. The executive order was rescinded in 2017 by Trump, which only, again, underscores that legislative action, not executive orders, is critical to address the concerns with this program. So now that brings us to our current fight. So Congressman Hank Johnson spoke a little bit about how this program has been authorized and, the policy bill that, has the program within the bill that has been the source of a lot of the heightened police militarization in our communities. So the NDAA fight, this is the annual defense authorization bill. The final, what we call the negotiated conference bill, will be voted on in the House and Senate after the November elections. And what advocates have been doing is trying to push for strong 1033 language to be incorporated in the final conference bill. Folks that have been engaged on this fight. Remember that in the Senate we had Senator Schatz, who offered his bipartisan amendment that unfortunately failed to achieve the 60 vote threshold. We got a bipartisan majority of 51 to 49, and that amendment specifically would have prohibited the use of transferring military equipment to local law enforcement agencies to be used against First Amendment protected activity. And unfortunately, while that amendment failed, we're still pushing to ensure that we get strong 1033 language in the final conference bill for the NDAA. And I wanted to just highlight that the champions that we have on this issue in the House and Senate, and Congressman Hank Johnson is one of them, who's been working on this issue for many, many years. And it was incredibly disheartening for advocates, for community members, organizations that have been working on this issue 24/7 for, immediately after Michael Brown was gunned down, and have been, again, working on lobbying to get this program ultimately shut down. We were incredibly disheartened that certain members in the House that we considered as allies, Democrats in the House Armed Services, that they essentially, as a result of pressure from various police unions, ultimately got Democratic leadership to not offer Hank Johnson's amendment to get a vote for consideration for the defense bill. So I mentioned that to again, just highlight how incredibly challenging this fight has been for all of us. We need to do everything we possibly can to continue to build our coalition and bring in unlikely allies that we ordinarily wouldn't think would be engaged in this fight, and do everything we possibly can to work to demilitarize our communities. And in terms of next steps, I encourage all of you to reach out to your House members, to your House member and your senators, and encourage them to support strong 1033 provisions to be incorporated in the final defense authorization bill. And in the House, we have a letter right now that Representative Anthony Brown is circulating that is going to go to the leadership of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee, again, reiterating the need to curtail this program and impose necessary oversight mechanisms. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing to fight to end militarism at home and abroad.
Thank you so much. That was Yasmin Tayeb, Senior Policy Counsel at Demand Progress. For those of you who are on the Brown webinar, please remember to submit questions via the Q&A chat box that you can type into. And on the Facebook live stream, please hit the share button to share with your friends as we go along. This is a cost of war panel on how police militarization has been intensified by the post-9/11 wars. And we have arrived at our last speaker, Rana Epting. She is the executive director of Move On, which is a member-led progressive grassroots organization. Move On has a deep history of organizing around ending wars and demilitarizing US police. Before becoming executive director, Rana helped lead activist campaigns at Move On and previously at Every Voice and the Service Employees International Union. She has a long history of commitment to youth organizing and served as the chair of the Alliance for Youth Organizing from 2017 to 2019. Thank you, Rana, so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm honored to be on this panel and so grateful for all the work everyone here is doing for this incredibly important cause. I wanted to build on some of what Yasmin was talking about in terms of the energy out there among the people around this issue. And I'll start by saying what we have been seeing happen in this country since June is simply remarkable. We are seeing a multiracial uprising for racial justice taking place daily on American streets, the likes of which we have not seen since the Civil Rights Movement, and evidence that this is actually the largest protest in American history. Many of us have been watching, participating, joining in the middle of these protests and seeing the diversity of the voices out there, people joining in solidarity to stand up for their fellow human beings, to stand up and fight for Black life. Every day, thousands of people are putting their bodies on the line to say enough. They're recognizing that this is the first and they're recognizing that this is first and foremost about putting an end to the police killing of Black people, to an end to systemic racism that infests our systems and society, and an end to an administration and presidency that doesn't just use racist dog whistles, uses a racist megaphone on a daily basis. And And they're recognizing that it's a distortion of our police system, period. That's what we're talking about. From what was supposed to be this dream that we grew up with as children of, police system that is a public service that protects and serves, and instead is a force that scares, harms, and commits violence against its own people. It doles out protection for a small minority and treats the rest of us as something that must be controlled. And while this movement has broad support from the majority of Americans, it is far too often being met on the streets by not just by police, but police with weapons of war, as all of my panelists have discussed. We have seen the images, armed vehicles on our streets, military helicopters flying low over protesters, tear gas, and more. We've turned to our loved ones and said, I never thought this would happen in America, and yet it is. Peaceful protesters are put in danger nightly by police forces that look more like an invading force in a foreign war. And this has been a troubling trend for some time, but has gotten far worse in recent years. And as my fellow colleagues have mentioned, it's been accelerated by federal programs that pass this equipment to police forces as well as police departments and waste millions of our dollars that could go to actually serving the communities in this country instead. And years of forever wars have made this worse. They've ingrained the images of this equipment into our brain. They've normalized war. And this, speaking to what one of the panelists mentioned, is our society is okay seeing these tanks and militarization in other countries, but we are currently also now being normalized and desensitized to seeing them here at home, when in fact, in both places, it is an atrocity. So we can never desensitize the weapons of war being used on human beings internationally or here at home on our citizens. And I'll say a bit about Move On and kind of how we come into, how we are seeing this moment here. We have close to 15 million members who live all across the United States. We're a multi-identity coalition of people all throughout this country who believe in taking collective action to make change. So we represent a diversity of age, race, background, class, geography, and more. And many of our members are out there in the streets protesting, taking a stand against what we're seeing as a combination of this militarization abroad and at home. And as you mentioned, we have an anti-war activist legacy that is alive and well. And it started on the heels of the atrocities of 9/11, when President Bush was so callously marching us into war with Iraq. And people stood up, they pushed back, they protested time and time again. And while it took us years to get out of Iraq, we eventually did. And what the movement ended up with was a solid anti-war majority that has and will last decades, if not generations. And it clearly showed that it's alive and well when we saw President Trump attempt to march us to war with Iran back in January. Yes, that was this year, 2020, if you remember. We had over 400 actions across the country demanding no war with Iran. These are volunteer-led. These were not staffed, propped-up actions. These were volunteer-led because the energy is out there in this country against war, against militarization, abroad and at home. And Move On members and hundreds of thousands of people in this country joined together to stand in support of Black lives and against the military-industrial complex that has infected our policing system, to stand against the racism that is pervasive in that very same system and our society, and to stand for a better way forward that values human life, that keeps us all safe, and allows us to protect and care for one another. So what I want to leave you with is the energy is not going away. People are connecting the dots. These two man-made societal problems are interconnected, and we are seeing it click in the hearts and minds of people all throughout this country, and they're willing to take action. They know we deserve better. They know we can do better, and they are in motion. They're ready and willing to do the work to create a better system, a better way of being in community, and people are willing to put the old ways behind us and start anew. So if that is not a testament to the power of the energy, the intensity that is out there, I don't know what is. But I really think there is a new moment in this country where people are waiting and they're ready to act, and they're themselves out there in order to make change. And the force we're seeing from this administration to stop it is only going to strengthen the resolve that there's something wrong here. There is, as Representative Johnson said, there is a cancer and we have to perform some surgery. So I'll stop there, but thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Rana. That was such an inspiring way to end a really wonderful panel with such a great set of perspectives that all contributed to one another in really fascinating ways. Thank you all so much for being here. This is the end of the live stream event, and we will now transition to a closed event open to those who registered for the Brown webinar, where you can pose Q&A to the panelists in your chat box. Thank you so much to our Facebook audience, and yeah, join us again.